for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
Get over there! Go back there, man! Get over there! He wants to kill me so bad he can taste me!
We appreciate you being back with us. I want to welcome any other guests out there that are back with us and have heard the last couple of interviews that we've done with Gary Wayne, who is a great researcher and author. Gary Wayne is a Christian Quantarian. He's maintained a lifelong love affair with biblical prophecy, history, and mythology. He has a book out that I think everyone should get called The Genesis 6 Conspiracy. Isn't that right, Gary? Isn't that the title of the book there?
That's exactly the name, and the subtitle to it is How Secret Societies and the Descendants of Giants Plan to Enslave Humankind. So
that's right, and as people that have already heard Gary on the show with us a little bit and heard some of the detail that we've been able to go into, they're familiar that the book is quite incredible. It's well researched, it's well footnoted, and it's extensive. I think it's a pretty big book. I think we already mentioned that it's somewhere around 800 something pages, right, Gary? 850 pages or something?
Yeah, just over 800 and over 120 pages of endnotes to substantiate all the different things that I talk about in the book. The book doesn't have a lot of speculation, so I'm letting other, whether it's historians or religions or mythologies or the Bible or Apocrypha, speak for itself and let the story tell itself as it comes out of those books and sources, and just connect the dots. But more importantly, to have the footnotes there so people can go verify what I'm saying and hopefully dig a little deeper if their curiosity is raised enough to do so.
That's right. And in the last session we were speaking, a word that came up and a subject that came up was Atlantis. And it seems like when you study secret societies or look into the secret orders in history, you find reoccurring the theme or concept or idea of Atlantis. It seems extremely important to them. And I have a little booklet by Manly P. Hall. I don't know, what do you think about that character, Manly P. Hall, Gary?
Well, I mean, I'm certainly not a fan of Mr. Hall, but he is one of those very, very important people who have written about Freemasonry and the secret societies. He's an adept. He talks with authority, and I don't believe, most of the material that he puts out there is propaganda. I think it's pretty much what they believe and what they do. So I like Manly as a source for, the insider view, along with others, as to, what they believe happened in history, what their organization is about, and what they're trying to bring about.
Because Manly was an adept, so he was a Mason, or he was part of a
Yes. Yeah, he was higher than third degree. He was significantly higher in his initiation. So how high that would go, don't know, but he would be at least in the old York sort of organizational structure of 3 degrees. He'd be at least 5th degree, because you have to be able to oversee other lodges and to go into the higher orders and learning of mysticisms. You have to continue to progress on that initiation. So he was significantly initiated into the higher degrees.
Mm-hmm. And I had a little paragraph from his book, little booklet called Atlantis, an Interpretation, where Manly P. Hall said the Atlanteans, like the mediums, did not possess supernatural powers. They were possessed by the powers. They were moved by the astral light like a planchette, as the sphere of the astral king was one of excess and fury. He poured forth his qualities through them until the whole civilization collapsed in a common ruin. it goes on. He does speak about a war. He speaks about a king that was there. He speaks about them becoming possessed by their own power. What can you tell us, Gary, about Atlantis, and what did you find when you were doing your research into the story of Atlantis?
And just to link in with what Mr. Hall was talking about in terms of Atlantis and the black magic, this is a common precept that runs through different mythologies and even religions. And, theosophy is a significant sort of an extension that came out of Gnosticism, which New Age is created from. But they all talk about this concept of how the original giants that ruled Atlantis and the religious polytheism that they had put into place utilized the polytheism and the knowledge from the polytheistical seven sciences and the development of those sciences, and ruled and applied that knowledge at first, according to their records, in a judicious manner. And Plato would go on and also write about this in the same sort of manner. So there's consistency here. But as sort of the human aspects started to overwhelm the Nephilim kings or the Titan kings, and the application of the sciences amongst the Magi or the wizards, because those are the priests of Atlantis and the ancient civilizations, progressed. Their application was not judicious in for the good of people anymore, but it slowly deteriorated into black magic, as the application that Hall was talking about, and into not for the good of humankind, and continued to backslide into total evil. And that's sort of the difference as they look at as in an antediluvian schism of white magic and black magic. They still talk about to this day. So if we want to understand sort of the infrastructure of Atlantis, we need to understand that there's a few different sort of things in partnership, as what we've talked about in the past shows, and it's just done in a polytheist manner. So in each of the 4 to 7 to 9 different civilizations of the antediluvian epoch, you have the watcher or the god of that cult center, right? And from that particular watcher or god, they create an organization of a snake brotherhood that I like to call them, but it's a religious brotherhood. And these are the priests and these are the wizards. These are the wise men. They're all the same terms. These are the Merlins. Merlins is just a title and another name for a priest of polytheism. And you have a Nephilim king that is in partnership with this priesthood and with this polytheist religion. So you have those three that are working together, and particularly this comes out in Atlantean mythology. So when you hear about astrology that they're credited for creating, and the zodiac, and all of the magic, and all the allegory, and all of the manifestations of magic wands, and alchemy, and spells, this is what is being talked about when it went from good magic to bad magic, as they like to sort of reinvent that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right. So they believe that the priests basically became corrupted with their own powers. Yes.
And in Atlantis, it was sort of at least from a Western perspective, it is the antediluvian civilization that is raised sort of above others, and it has an overflow effect to so many Western civilizations. Although I would argue, in particular, let's say from an empire called Mu, would have significant effects on Central America, North America, and India, and into China as well after the flood. So, but Atlantis, maybe I should go through and just give a little bit more background on what my research and what I write about in the book in terms of what Atlantis was, so that people understand it. Would that be a good place to start?
Excellent.
Okay. So, and I talk about this as the same sort of parallel story as Genesis, or the same parallel story that's going on in Sumeria with the Sumerian civilization. It would be the same similar story that's going on in Mu with the Vedas and the mythology that comes out of that part of the world. And so we have with Atlantis, you have the god Poseidon. So he would be part of, because this now comes out of, from what I'm talking about now, the references from Greek mythology, and would come out of the Greek gods of Mount Olympus, with Poseidon being the god of Atlantis. And this was what people narrowly look at as a one-continent empire somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. And I don't really want to get into all the different theories as to where it might be located, but beyond the Pillars of Hercules anyways. And so Poseidon, he mates as a fallen angel or a watcher or a god, depending on how you want to look at that. He mates with a human female by the name of Clymene. And again, she has a few different names in different mythologies, but he creates from this marriage and copulation and sex thereof 5 sets of twins that come out of this copulation, and these are Titan gods. And so within the Atlantean Empire, you have 10 different empires over and above Atlantis. And it was a significant empire. So this is sort of the larger Atlantis sort of concept. And, you know, they were into North Africa, into Libya, into Egypt. They had penetrated into southwestern Europe as far as Italy by some of these mythologies. They were into the Yucatan, so they were crossing over into the Mu Empire. They were also into Ireland in Western Europe, so they're starting to move into the Asgard in the Northern Empire. And they were also into even to certain parts of Lower Egypt as well, so into the Egyptian Empire, and then again part of the Mu, and also into the British Isles. And so this was an expanding empire because they were trying to create world government by conquering the world. But as Plato talks about, is they were checked by the Athenians and prevented from doing so. So this is the greater empire, and this Atlantean Empire is thought to have technology that rivaled what we have today. And then by implication, then the other cult centers or empires of the antediluvian world would have probably had similar technology, because they all had the same structure, from the Watcher to the Nephilim King. So it doesn't matter, and to the wizards and the Magi and the polytheist religion. So it doesn't matter whether you're talking about Sumeria with the Anunnaki mythology and giants and religion, or it's the Chinese with the Maotzi. Again, they had similar polytheist religion with that. And it doesn't matter wherever you go into the subcontinent of India, and with whether or not it's the Asuras or the Daitia or the Danua and several other names and the various gods that they had, and then the Brahmin type of religion that also partnered with this kingship. You have the same sort of structure around the world. So one presumes, with all that being in the same place, that even though some kingdoms may have been more powerful than others, they were all fairly highly developed in technology. But what was going on with Atlantis is they wanted to conquer all of these empires. And so one presumes that out of the initial Atlantis, all of these other areas where Poseidon placed his sons as kings, as Titan kings, those other areas that made up the 10, that they may have been carved out already and were sort of later in that development of the Atlantean history.
And his sons were set up as the kings of each area, of each region there?
Yes.
And his the progenitor, this has to do also with like a progenitor race. Where do you see the Nephilim story fitting into this Atlantis story that comes out of Greece? Or really, originally, Gary, I was going to say, it sort of comes out of Egypt more so, right? Because Solon related this information to Plato, and Solon got it from Egyptian priests, the story, correct? So,
and Plato, he receives this information from Solon going to Egypt and to save Egypt, SAIS, and he actually reads according to Plato and other historians, ancient historians, that off this Atlantean story off of reliefs, off of obelisks. And so he meets with Egyptian priests, and he learns of this, and he takes it back. Now, who Solon is he is actually a descendant of Plato is actually a descendant of Solon. So it sort of this passes down through the family. And other historians that will support this account as not being mythology but history would be people like Marcellus, Aristotle, Plutarch, and the Roman historian Procles. And so there's a lot of sort of ancient support for this story that is being told by Plato in two different stories, one being Timaeus and the other one being Critias. And Critias is his unfinished episode about this because he dies. That's why he doesn't finish it. And who Critias is the great-grandfather, at least the name of his great-grandfathers or Plato's great-grandfather. And so all of this has sort of this sort of elite nobility, priesthood, philosophy, religion sort of connection that also, I think, in the polytheist belief system gives it credibility that there's something to the Atlantean mythology, and it rings very, very true with Genesis 6, where you have fallen angels going to human females, creating Titan King.
So where do you see that correlation in the tradition and the mythologies that are found in Plato, and that are also found in the story in Genesis 6? Where do you see those correlations?
Well, I would make the correlation that Poseidon, who's one of the gods of Mount Olympus, would be a watcher fallen angel of what Enoch in the Book of Enoch talks about as the seven cult centers. And now, again, there's a disagreement. There could be 4 to 9, depending on who you're talking to in mythology, right? And so if you go to that more recent show, The Game of Thrones, they actually have 9 empires. But that's not everything is an agreement on mythology, so somewhere between 4 and 9. But likely the number is 7. And so so Poseidon would be one of those watcher gods. And then Poseidon mating with a human female, which is like the daughters of men in Genesis 6, creating Nephilim in Genesis 6, or Titans in the Greek mythology or the Atlantis mythology. So it's an identical spelling. And also, we have the same sort of idea where you have Enochian mysticism that we've talked about in the past being part of the Nephilim Empire, developed by Enoch, son of Cain, including the black magic, including astrology, which is, the same religion that's being talked about in Atlantis. And you also have the Nephilim, after their immortality is restricted, they start to turn their vengeance on humankind and start to create war. Very, very similar story. Just
so it'd be
maybe a different pair.
Go ahead. Sorry, Gary. Go ahead.
I think so. It's going to be either a corruption of the biblical account, which is one perspective I would have, or the other one is it's a parallel polytheist account of the same set of events.
And it guided sort of. I mean, with the don't you see that the story of Atlantis and the ideas of Atlantis sort of are the origins of the ideas for democracy?
No, it was a totalitarian state.
Okay.
Right? So there was no democracy. I mean, democracy coming out of Greeks didn't really happen till, about 600 BC. So, I mean, we're talking thousands of years before that. So, no, there was no democracy there, although the secret organizations that revel in Atlantean mythology and polytheism, I mean, they are very big proponents of democracy, as I am. But I think that's more of a recent sort of thing as opposed to an ancient sort of doctrine that they're accepting.
So, but this Atlantis, some say that it sunk into the ocean. It seems that you sort of go along with the idea that it wasn't just one island; it was a global It was a global empire that was set up of different kingdoms, not just that it was one.
Yeah, I think it was. I mean, it was either one pure civilization in prehistory that with the disbursement of humankind after the flood, where these stories disseminate to all different continents, or there are different civilizations, and everybody has to wrestle with that themselves. But it would seem from other sources that there were more than one civilization. And Enoch, which runs very, very close, the first book of Enoch, which runs very, very close to biblical accounts, seems to suggest there's about 7 of those. And so when we consider all of that, then there would have to be different versions out there that tell a similar story, but that are sort of different in the vernacular, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, you also studied the Epic of Gilgamesh. I mean, this is a similar story, right?
Well, it is, and that's the Sumerian version. So you have a story there where Gilgamesh is, hooks up with Enkidu, and both are demigods, right? So they're 2/3 God and 1/3 human, and they're created in the typical form of an Anunnaki or a Titan. So they're another form of Nephilim. And although there's 5 or 6 different stories going on in the Epic of Gilgamesh, when you get to somewhere around Tablet 11 or Tablet 12, it deals with the flood story with Utnapishtim or Ziusudra, depending which language you're going to translate it from. And it's about the flood story, and again, a similar story of about this great civilization that became very, very corrupt and also very, very militant, and the survival story of the giants, because again, Utnapishtim is 2/3 God and 1/3 human, and Enkidu, who the story is being told to, is 2/3 God and 1/3 human, and Enkidu for sure is procreated after the flood to offset the evilness of Gilgamesh, even though they become friends. And Utnapishtim was the king of Uruk in Sumeria before the flood, at the time of the flood, and he and his close family are chosen to survive the flood. So again, similar story, but this is about Nephilim survival as opposed to human survival.
Mm-hmm. Where in the Bible? Go ahead.
And let me throw in some other things, sort of interrupt, but because I think I sidetracked myself on a couple of things there. But when we look at other similar accounts of Atlantis, whether or not they're the same or they're different, you have the 5 cities of Sumeria, which are famous cities that have a similar sort of destruction as what Atlantis has, and you also have like Dwarka in India, which is a sunken city that the Vedas and the Indian history would take that back to, and another one that would be Mahabalipuram, if I pronounced that right and remembered it correctly. Again, ancient sunken cities with a very, very similar story. So again, either a recanting of the Atlantean story or the same type of event that overthrew those 2 cities. And it was not just a flood in the mythology accounts, but also a conflagration of catastrophes that are started with the Pleiades. 3 stars of the Pleiades, as the allegory goes, are 3 asteroids that hit the oceans that set off the flood catastrophe. And so there's volcanoes, there are earthquakes, and a whole bunch of different things are going on to cause the flood. Just as that is very, very, very similar to what Enoch tells about, was it the conflagration of several catastrophe events, just not the waters from underneath boiling over and causing a flood. And you can also, if you want to dig into the Bible, and I do in my book, I'll give some examples as to this further destruction that goes on in the Bible with the flood account. So there are things you can look to in the Bible that would match up to that. So I know Genesis says just the flood, but other verses in the Bible will suggest that there is more going on than just the flood.
Mm-hmm.
I would also suggest from a biblical account, for again, the the Bible also talks about Pleiades, as well as Orion, which are, again, constellations that are in mythology that are closely related to the flood story. So, you can look in the book of Job, you can look in the book of Amos, and in the Psalms, and you'll find very sort of odd reflections to these constellations and seemingly to a flood catastrophe. And also in Isaiah 23, I think people should have a closer look at that verse as well, because this is a verse that is, most people just consider it as being part of the destruction of Tyre. But it's more of an allegory, and it's got some antediluvian markers in there. So I think it's actually an account of what happened before the flood with Atlantis. It has to do with Tyre, although it's not totally accurate for Tyre, and it's also a allegory for the end time. So I think it's a very, very important verse in the Bible to understand possibly what happened in Atlantis. And in Isaiah 23, just as some of the markers, so the audience knows what I'm talking about, it's the city of revelry in the old city. And old, or any ancient, or any words like that are always a marker to before the flood, which is very, very interesting. Yeah. And it was a bestower of crowns, just as Nippur, which is the center of the earth, or Atlantis was the center of the earth, and there's all these other centers of the earth in all the different mythologies where the kingships were issued by the gods to the Nephilim or Anunnaki or Nephilim kings, and this is where the ring lord allegory comes from, because they were the lords of the kings of the ring of the antediluvian sort of world order. You also have it as the renowned city of the earth, which is another significant marker for Atlantis and these great cities and the Nephilim, because they were the renowned of the earth. They were the mighty ones, that were the heroes of old. And God talks about bringing down their pride, and it was the pride of the Nephilim, it's the pride of the Titans, it's the rebellion that they have, it's the hubris, which is another word that goes back as those cataclysms of the flood and the Nephilim in the etymology. And so it's this pride thing that it is also talking about that God is going to bring down in the destruction of Tyre in Isaiah 23. And it says that the sea and the kingdoms of the world are going to tremble, and their fortresses are going to be destroyed. And these are all sort of, to me, clear markers that it is a greater story being told there than just Tyre. And Tyre isn't an island city, although there is a piece of it in ancient Tyre that was separated from water that Alexander actually had to build a bridge across to get at it to invade the final portions of Tyre.
And he spent a long time. Go ahead. I was going to say he spent a very long time building that bridge. It was really important to get onto that island for him.
Yeah, it was a holdout, and he wasn't going to move on until he took over. And it was the trading city of the world at that time, so it was very, very important from a business perspective. And so, when you look into somebody, let's say, like Berosus or Belisar, depending on the translation, he was this historian of the time of Alexander who worked at the temple of Belur, and he was chosen to write the history of the Babylonians, so it wouldn't be lost to history, just as the Romans did the same thing with Josephus for the Jewish people, and just as was done in Manetho in Egypt later on by the Greeks as well, at a similar time. So it's more like probably the fourth empires of the Ptolemy kingships that were ruling the world after Alexander. And so he considered Babylon to be and Babylon City to be a metaphor for the ancient city of Atlantis, which is a significant sort of connection. And when we look at this great city of Babylon in the end time, this is a city that centers the religion of the end time, and it also is the city that houses the world's business center. And so this is, again, why when you look at Tyr sort of reflects that business aspect of Babylon of the end times. Just as Nineveh will represent in the allegory of Revelation the wickedness and the torturing of the saints and the viciousness of it, and just as Atlantis is another sort of metaphor for the ancient city, because it's this city of old, this great old city in Revelations, and it houses all of these other allegories, and just as Babylon is, and Babel is the religion of the end time. So all of that sort of comes together in Revelation allegory, if you can understand the allegories and the history that's written into the Bible.
Well, fascinating. And do you see that pride, when you studied the Vedic tradition and its references to Atlantis, did you see that pride and was a theme as well as a root for destruction?
Yes, they all rebel against the gods. It doesn't matter whether or not you go to North America, it's the same story. And it doesn't matter whether you go into Central America, it's the same story. And they all start off as righteous rulers with this polytheist religion, and then they all degenerate into evil and into black magic and to rebelling against the gods. Mm-hmm. And again, in the Atlantean account, that they tell the best account, I think, although some other people might say the Vedas has a better account. But you have this rebellion against the gods that Zeus puts down, and these rebellious titans are put into Tartarus, which is another word that you can use for abyss as it translates into the Bible. So, again, some other interesting parallels there.
And these rebellion titans, as you see it, would be sons of the daughters of. They would be sons of the Nephilim, or they would be the Nephilim.
Yeah. So I mean, if you're looking at let's say Chinese mythology, you have the Maiotsi, which are the sons of heaven, which are the same as the sons of God. If you have the Anunnaki, they're the sons of Anu, Anu being heaven. If you have if you have the Vedas, you have the same sort of allegory, and I'm just trying to think of what they called them, but they were also, again, the sons of the gods. I'm just trying to think of what that name might have been, but still a similar type of story, that all of these gods were created, all of these demigods were created from the gods through human females.
Mm-hmm. 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 The Ideatas? No. The Aditas? No. I just wondered what that name is in the Vedic tradition. But yeah, you see this story all over the world. No matter where you go, it's the same story. So we can just say that, yes, it happened and Atlantis existed, for sure.
Yeah. And coming out of the destruction of Atlantis, you also have a very, very similar story that goes into what they call the seven sages that are sent out from this great brotherhood all around the world. And the same story, whether it's China, or they go to India, or they go to Egypt, or they go to Greeks, or they go to Central America. And so these are the seven great sages of the antediluvian world, and these are ones that were mentored by the Watchers into this snake brotherhood, as I like to call them. And so whether or not they're called the seven sages, the Nagas, the Nakals, the Oannes, it's the same sort of group that is told about re-educating the humans after the flood that stems out of these great civilizations.
And these would be these seven, I guess, teachers would be the origins of most occult orders on Earth today.
Oh, absolutely. So, they would be people like, Hermes that are, come out of the Middle East area that would have, and he comes in, even though he's not listed in the Bible, he partners according to the Freemasons and is the son of Cush, son of Cub, as I recall, and brings this knowledge to Nimrod that they put in place in Babel. And some other names of people, around the earth that would be like Yu of China, and was helped by the dragons to re-civilize the world, or Yima in Zoroastrianism, or whether it's Quetzalcoatl or somebody else that he brings along, like the White Brother, as they're known in North America, from the Snake Clan of the White Brother, or other names are Oannes, which is also, some people think is the same as Enoch of the antediluvian world. But these are the leaders of that religion that I'm talking about, and they're selected at the time of the flood to be saved and to teach the humans, because all knowledge, all technology, everything's going to be lost, and they have to start all over. So they're selected to do it. And in the Vedas, they have 7 of these sages in a boat that survives with the subcontinent of India's Noah in the Vedas, in terms of how they tell the flood story.
Mm-hmm. Is that 7? Do you think it's that in actuality it was more than 7, and the 7 number is just a reference to a star system?
Well, I don't know whether the 7 is a reference to a star system or not, and I don't know for sure, because the Bible doesn't say that there was 4 or 7 or 9 civilizations. This is just information that comes up that I just use as context for better understanding what was going on in the Genesis account, so that people understand how the whole world becomes corrupted, right?
Because there was certainly almost like a civil war in Atlantis. There was,
yes.
There was a presence of black magic, but was there a presence of, I guess there's no delineation in your mind between white and black magic, but was there a presence of what you would consider to be a Yahweh or the Almighty? I mean, was it a godly place, do you think, Atlantis?
Okay, so in all of these different accounts, people sort of have to come back to what is the principle of the religions to sort of understand things, and it'll help understand when we know that they believe that what happens on the earth is a reflection of what happens in the heavens, whether that's a projection or a matrix or however you want to define that in polytheism. So they believe that what happens on earth happens in heaven. So in that respect, then the rebellion against the gods in polytheism would be a reflection and an allegory of the rebellion of the fallen angels and the gods in heaven from who we would call the true God of the universe, right? So they just record it differently. And so that these titans aren't rebelling in polytheism, in my opinion, away from the gods of polytheism. They're rebelling against the all-powerful God that's over and above these watchers. Right? So there's a lot of misinformation that comes down as to what happens in the antediluvian epoch through polytheism. And so the rebellion, again, is just a reflection of the fallen angels' rebellion. And the 7 watchers who are ruling over the antediluvian epoch are already rebellious angels, right? And that's why this whole polytheist religion that leads people away from God is taking place. And when we talk about the 7 watchers, typically, and some will say there's 8, and if they do that, that's the leader, and so that would be Satan, and how we would understand it. But if you want to bring it back to Enoch, these 7 watchers of these kingdoms would be Azazel, Amasis, Gradiel, Barachiel, Kokariel, Tamiel, Azrael, as being those watchers of these cult centers that I talked about at the start of the show. And so, again, although this rebellion happens all over the earth, in polytheist recantation, they're rebelling against the gods. Because, again, they're losing their immortality, just as what is denoted in the Bible. And so they're rebelling against the gods to become physical gods on earth, and against the Watcher overlords, but really they're rebelling against the God of the universe, right? The God of the Bible. Because he's the one who limits their immortality, as it says, 120 years in Genesis 6.
It limits their mortality because of, for what reason? Because they broke a covenant that they had with.
Well, the Watchers broke a law against creation. And so what's not permitted in the laws of creation, as Enoch sets out, this isn't in the Bible, you just get sort of the ramifications of this, just so that people understand where I'm coming from here. What he says, Enoch, is that this was a violation against the laws of creation. And that's defined by, you're not permitted to have the spirit of heaven mixed with the physical world of our world. So you have the spiritual dimension and the spirits of the angels and everybody who lives in there, and then you have the physical world. And what they've done is that they've transplanted the immortal spirit of heaven into a physical body that created the Titans and the Nephilim. That's not permitted. And what happens as an extension of that is God limits future generations to 120 years, as it takes the time to play out to make that happen. And secondly is those bodies aren't immortal in the physical world, right? So the bodies eventually either die out or they're killed, but their spirits don't go to sleep. And again, these are reprobate spirits, and they're not permitted into heaven, and they're not permitted to go to sleep like humans are until the resurrection. And so these are the demons that roam. Right, so the demons are different than fallen angels. The demons are the bodiless spirits of these demigods that are created, called Nephilim, Titan, Anunnaki, Azura, Tria, whatever you want to call them around the world. And so the reason why they're so upset is because they know that they have been damned, for lack of a better word, for being the first generation, and they know their bodies are going to die, and then they also know their offspring are not going to be immortal.
Plus, they're sort of trapped.
They're trapped.
And their destiny is told to be what? I mean, what is the destiny of these unembodied? I guess you'd call them gods of the dead, or I don't even know what you'd refer to.
Yeah, well, and again, you get a reflection of this. I'm going to answer your question in a second, but when you get into Greek mythology and you get into Chinese mythology and religion, you have these ghost vagabonds, as they're known in ancient Chinese religion, and in the Greek mythology, it's called hero worship. What's going on is these rulers who are the Nephilim and the Titans, once their bodies died, they would come back because their spirits wouldn't go to sleep, and they would haunt the towns, and there would be vicious beings because they're so upset that they no longer have a physical body, that they have to roam in the spirit. So they would come back to haunt where they ruled, and the people who lived there would try and honor them and pacify them and do sacrifices to them and to worship them, just so that they wouldn't cause problems. So that's where all of that sort of comes from. And I'm sorry, what was the real question? I forgot what the question was now.
Well, we can get back to that other question, but you did say these are the vagabonds, you said, known as the vagabonds, or the
vagabond spirits, ghost spirits of China.
Wow. And so I was going to ask you, what kind of things would they do when they haunt these people? Or what kind of things were they notorious for?
Well, I think they're notorious for everything that you would know demons doing in our world today, right? So they could possess people, they would cause people harm. So all the powers that you would know a demon has is the things that they would do. And again, when we look at Jesus, he is encountering demons in the New Testament, and the most famous one is Legion. And Legion is afraid that Jesus is going to send them to judgment or to the abyss before their time. Right? And so what Jesus does is he takes them out of this body and they enter it into the pigs and they run over the cliff. But this is the abyss that they're talking about, where the fallen angels and the worst of the demons were put after the flood. Right? And then in Revelation 9, you have these demons and the fallen angels being released into the end time, the impassioned fallen angels. And so you have two different classes of demons and two different classes of fallen angels that everybody should be aware of. There's the ones that were imprisoned, so the worst of the demons, and the impassioned fallen angels were put into the abyss. But that also means there are demons, as Jesus testifies to, and other unimpassioned fallen angels that are still working havoc on the world.
Mm. And could these different classifications be at war with one another even?
Yeah, I mean, they were in the past, and I don't think they're totally monolithic, and certainly they know from a demon level and a angelic level that their fate has been sealed. And, certainly that's one of the things that Jesus did, and it's recorded in the book of Peter, that when he is in the grave for 3 days, he actually goes and visits these spirits in the abyss, and he announces to them that their rebellion has failed, and it's over, and they will be judged in the end time, or at the end of the millennium. I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm. Yes. When you looked back into studying and doing your research, you found more about Atlantis. Did that change your perception of the creation, the creation story as it's put down in the beginning of Genesis?
To a certain degree, yeah. But I was also, when I was looking at creation as a whole, is not comfortable with one of the sort of cardinal rules that I like to stick by and try and make work. And one of those things is that I don't believe the Bible ever contradicts itself, and I do believe it's the Word of God. And so when I read Genesis 1 and I read Genesis 2, I see some things in there that don't make some sense. And so that started me to do some looking. And so if I look in the King James Version about the people created on day 6 that are created to replenish the earth, well, that's a very, very odd statement. Now, in other translations, it doesn't say replenish, and it can say fill the earth. It could be translated either way, but King James Version uses the word replenish. And so that sort of started leading me back to how many other things could be translated in one or two ways, and do we actually have the correct understanding of Genesis 1 and the Eden account. And so I would say that these other accounts tell context of the antediluvian epoch, and it also might give credibility to the effect that perhaps in Genesis 1, and this is very contentious, Genesis 1:1 to Genesis 1:2, is that the earth was renewed at that period of time as opposed to being created at that point in time. Because, again, if you go to other translations, it says the earth was renewed as opposed to the earth was created. And when you go back to Hebrew, and you're getting into the words buhu and tuhu as we go through this, which gets pretty technical, but you all of a sudden understand that there's two translations there that are possible. That the earth was renewed, and therefore if it was renewed, then what happened to it before? Was there a world before? Was it destroyed, and was it renewed? And to back up that renewal aspect, if you go into Psalms 104, 3, as I recall, it talks about when the Spirit is hovering over the earth is renewed, which is the same language that is used in Genesis 1:2. So if that's the case, then the world is significantly older. But I believe the Atlantean account still falls after that. So that's got nothing really to do with how old the earth is, but it does start to answer some other questions like, when did the angelic rebellion happen? Did it happen, basically on day 6 or day 7, or was it sometime into prehistory? That's even before Genesis 1:2. And then when I looked at the account that is given to us in the Eden account and the details that are given to us in the Genesis 1 account and the day 6 account, is I can't reconcile the two. They're talking about two different stories altogether. And so, again, I don't believe the Bible ever contradicts itself. So I think there's probably, if I look at it from the creation of the people in day 6 to Adam and Eve, then I think they're telling two different stories. Even to the effect when you look at the ancient Hebrew and in the King James Version or any other version that, unless it consolidates everything as God in some of the translations, is you have two different words for God. You have Elohim in Genesis 1, and you have Jehovah Elohim, or Lord God, or Yahweh God, depending on how you want to translate that, as the story in Genesis 2. But just to give a couple examples that are different in the Genesis 1 account to the Eden account is that the biggest one for me is that you have human beings being created male and female and seemingly in numbers and told to replenish the earth. But in the Eden account, you have Adam being created and at some point later being put into the Eden garden and not told to repopulate the earth at that point in time. And at some point in time later, Eve is created, not at the same time, but later, and from the rib of Adam. And that the people who are seemingly created in day 6, they're like hunters and gatherers by the description, that all the food and everything on the earth is going to be for them. And the people in the Eden account are agrarians. They're told to farm Eden. Again, two different accounts. You also have a different account of the order of events in terms of what's being created when in the Eden account than in the Genesis or in the day 6 account. So between days basically 3, 4, 5, and 6, there's a whole different order of how things are being done. And again, without trying to litigate the whole different thing, because there's just so many, I just wanted to give a few examples as to how they're different. And another significant one is that the people of day 6 were told they could eat from any and all the trees of the earth. But in the Eden account, they're told they can't eat from the tree of good and evil and knowledge. And again, that doesn't sort of line up. So there's a lot of different things going on. And if there's listeners out there that wanted to get a hold of me and want to know how day 6 and the Eden account are different, I have a attachment I can send to people that will give a blow-by-blow account of how they're different. And for me, how I understand that is that they're two different creations. And if there's two different creations there, then there's another gap there. And we don't know how long that period is.
In your estimation, the Adam and Eve story, I guess you'd call that story 1, and then the version 6, story 6, Adam and Eve story happened way before version 6 in history.
Well, certainly from some polytheist perspectives, you would have the Eden account being before, but we get a genealogy in the Eden account that's about from 6,000 years from where we are from now to back then. So I kind of think that day 6 happens before the creation of Adam and Eve. And I also believe they're the same species, because when you take male and female back to Hebrew, it's the same word Adam that's being used for Adam and the creation of man there. So I think they're the same species, but again, what's different in the Eden account is God is actually breathing life into Adam, and I think he's created for a different commission as to what's gone on in this watcher ruled over antediluvian world, that he's going to be eventually the salvation of humankind, but first humankind is going to have to be tested, which they fail in Eden first. And then through Noah, and then through Abraham, which brings the Messiah, is sort of the long-term plan that brings about human salvation. But if you did want to dig into some differences there, or a little bit more detail on what I said about Genesis 1:1, we can talk about that too. But it's kind of down a different rabbit hole.
Yeah, it is, but it's incredibly interesting, and maybe we'll cover that soon enough. As we've been going on about Atlantis, I was wondering, since we're still in Genesis, though I do like that, the tree of good and evil. So you see that as a literal tree that was in the garden, or do you believe that this is an allegory for genetics or for sciences that shouldn't be?
Well, the polytheists believe that account is completely, and the Gnostics in particular think it's a totally allegorical account.
Right.
Having said that, they like to intermix what is allegory and what is narrative. But literally in the story, and I believe the Bible is literal, and an allegorical approach, even as it comes into Christianity, is a Gnostic doctrine. So to me, it's Gnostic corruption of Christianity, and it's a schism between Gnosticism and the literalists that produced the original Christian church, and they've been fighting ever since. When anybody tells me there's an allegory involved, it's either from my perspective and how I approach things, and I know other people will have a different approach, but it needs to be defined within the Bible. And if you can't do that, then you can't apply an allegory there.
Mm. And what do you mean by defined?
Well, no, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, what do you mean by defined within the Bible?
Well, so if you have an allegory that's used, let's say in Revelations, where you have like the Babylon religion, right? You want to understand the Babylon religion and what it's all about in the terms of prostitution and things that are associated with what Revelation says is wrong with polytheism. You need to go back into the Bible and understand who Babylon is, what adultery is, and what prostitution is in that allegorical sense, and it'll define what that meaning is for you. But there's nothing that's in the Bible that is going to say that the story in Adam is an allegory. And Jesus fully supports and says everything that is written in the Old Testament is true, right? Mm-hmm. So, and an allegory you have to be very, very careful of. And again, what the polytheists are going to do is they're going to use allegory to degrade the meaning of the Bible and redefine it in the end time, just as they're going to do that with the resurrection. So when they look at the story of Jonah, which they like to pick on in particular, is they say it can't be real. But it's a story of Jonah being 3 days in the whale at the bottom of the abyss or the ocean and surviving. And they say, well, there's no way that could happen. And they like to, and people will say, yeah, that's just a story. It's just an allegory. But here's the thing. Jesus said to the people of the Jewish nation of that time is the only sign I'm going to give you is the sign of Jonah. And what the secret societies and the polytheists are going to use, and they say this, so it's not like I'm making it up, is that they are going to say that the New Testament is a complete allegory, the whole Old Testament is a complete allegory, and so is the resurrection, just as Jesus said, because Jonah is an allegory. And so when you get back to the tree of good and evil, it is a tree that had fruit on it that's good for eating, right? And they ate of the apple, right? Now, the allegory that Gnostics like to use is that is, and they take this back to possible translations, and it's a real stretch, and they can't back it up, and they like to ignore the part that it's good for food, but they say that is the serpent, Satan, having sex with Eve.
Right.
So you can see where you go when you start getting into this allegory, because if it's an allegory and it's defined outside the Bible like what the Gnostics do, then you can apply almost any meaning to it that what you want. And then they say that that's how they believe that Cain is the son of Lucifer. And it's Gnostic doctrine, and they're not always consistent, but they write about in the Gnostic Gospels about Cain is either the son of Satan and Eve, or Eve is raped by several different fallen angels to produce Cain, and or Cain is the son of Lilith and Satan. And so they say that is, the Gnostics will then go on to Genesis 3 and say the seed of the serpent is the allegory that can't be taken through the whole narrative in Genesis 3, as I recall, in terms of the tree of good and evil. But they like to overlay that as the meaning. And then they raise Cain to being a demigod, another Nephilim-type character.
Which they see as a victim, almost.
No, because they look at Cain as being this ennobled bloodline, a demigod, right? So he's actually the start of the ennobled bloodlines and the first king of the 10 kings of the antediluvian epoch. And so that's why he and his son his son Enoch was also thought to be a demigod as well in their belief system. And he writes these scriptures, and they start mysticism, the secret societies, and then by generation 6, they're already pre-biased to want to create more Nephilim because of Cain being a king and starting this whole sort of rule and destiny of a Nephilim, and that the human females that they send there, are predisposed with religion to copulate with angels. And you don't need that allegory overlaid to understand what the Bible means by the seed of the serpent in Genesis 3. And just so that people understand what I'm talking about, says that there will be enmity between the seed of the serpent and Eve, from that point on, right? This is after the fall. And so if you look at Genesis 6, that's where the seed of the serpent comes in my opinion, because these are seraphim angels creating these titans, Nephilim, demigods, and they look just like them, and the seraphim angels had the face of a viper or a snake.
Yeah, I think you said before a white snake, right? Okay.
Yeah, that's the Native Americans call them, as the White Snake Clan. But if you go into Atlantean mythology, they also describe the Titans as snakes, and they also had very white skin, and they had either blonde hair and blue eyes or red hair and green eyes.
Fascinating.
And slanted eyes and eyes that glowed. And again, you move into Central American mythology, they have the same descriptions. You move into Egyptian mythology, and they have the same descriptions.
And your reading of Cain is different than you were just explaining the allegory ideas. So, what is your reading of Cain and?
Well, I think Cain is the son of Adam and Eve, just as Abel was, and what people will utilize to say differently is that when it talks about the birth of Cain, Cain sounds very much like the Hebrew word acquired. And then when it goes into the second verse in there about Eve having a son or begets Cain, that word goes back to, could also be translated as acquired. So they loosely, very tenuously say that's the backup for Cain being acquired, aka adopted, because it's given to them. But if it's the allegory of Satan fathering with Eve, then that's now in contradiction with what they say. So it really gets sort of tangled when you start moving into those allegories. My belief is it's just as the Bible says. Cain's the son of Adam and Eve, and he kills Abel, and he gets ostracized, and he moves to Nod, which is another interesting story. It's a place, and he builds a city, which makes no sense, and he gets a wife, which makes no sense, because there's not going to be any more males and females, according to the Bible, until Seth is 130 years old, and then more sons and daughters are born. And Seth is the third born. And so where does the wife come from?
Right.
And why build a city? For who?
Where's that city, Nod? Where would that be? Somewhere in Samaria? Or? Yeah,
one presumes it's in Samaria. It says east of Eden, wherever Eden was. So somewhere in the Middle East towards the east. but we really don't know exactly where it was. Although, if you match that up with Sumerian mythology, it's somewhere in the kingdom of the the 5 great antediluvian city-states.
Yeah. Fascinating. Well, I know also John Dee. John Dee. I just to change gears a little bit. It still has to do a bit with Cain and the ideas of about Cain and his killing of Abel. But John Dee was also looking, or said that he contacted the spirits of Atlantis. Now, John Dee, the astrologer of the Queen.
Mentor of Bacon, yes.
Right, mentor of Bacon, and neither one of them would write their stuff down. Wasn't that right? Or they wrote some things, but they wouldn't write down what they really knew. Apparently, right?
Yeah, there's some things, as with all of the occult, that they like to keep to an oral tradition because they just don't want those things being out into the public. They want to keep it secret.
Mm-hmm. Well, we covered a lot. I love this, and Gary, I'm so happy you were here, and it was great speaking with you. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention, maybe your website or anything else?
Yes, if somebody wanted to get a hold of me, you can get a hold of me through my website at www.genesis6conspiracy.com. That's Genesis 6 with the number 6. And on that website, I'll have some interviews so you can get a better idea of what's in the book. And I also have a generous excerpt on all 98 chapters to give you a good flavor for the book. You can buy the book there if you want to buy the book there. You just go to Buy Now. You can connect through to barnesandnoble.com or amazon.com or Kindle, where you can get a signed copy. And you can also send me an email there and make comments or ask me any questions that you want. You can follow me on Facebook under Gary Wayne, and also Genesis 6 pages. I have 2. And again, you contact me through the Gary Wayne. I will get back to you. And you can also follow me or contact me on Twitter at GaryWayne63, at GaryWayne63.
Excellent. And there he is, Gary Wayne. Thank you for listening out there. And Gary, thanks for being here. We'll talk to you soon.
Very happy to have been here today, and hopefully we've raised